All right, we have 46 people already watching. I think we can go ahead and start.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Carol Sue Zients, Sisterhood co-president. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our afternoon program, Judaism Through the Arts, in which we will explore the ornamental style of Art Nouveau. This time I want to give a special thank you to Susie Askenase and Susan Auschler, who have worked so very, very hard to bring you this exciting program this afternoon. And also thank you, Lita Karchmer, for taking care of all the registration so that we could all be here with you today. Now I'd like to introduce my co-president, Claire Brooks.
Hi, I'm Claire Brooks, the other co. 16 years. Judaism Through the Arts began in 2006 when the Museum of Fine Arts reached out to then Sisterhood President Linda Zoll. The museum was looking for community involvement, and with much gratitude, JTTA, which is what we call Judaism Through the Arts, is still going strong. It is one of the programs eagerly awaited by Sisterhood members. The Museum of Fine Arts has educated and entertained us with wonderful art history presentations, always Jewish related in some way. In past years, before COVID, we always had a delicious assortment of homemade goodies to snack on. This year, to try to help keep JTA traditions strong and something that we always enjoyed, Susie and Susan, the chairs of JTTA, and I decided to offer bags of treats to each attendee delivered to their home by Sisterhood Door Dashers. A big shout out to Susie and Susan, who have worked really hard with Helga Aurisch, Margaret Mims, Christine Gervais to present this year's Judaism Through the Arts program. Right now, please check to be sure that you are muted. And questions and answers will be submitted by clicking on the Q&A icon, the letters Q and A, rather than a chat box. But you treat it as you would the chat box. Just type in your question. We know you will enjoy hearing about Art Nouveau. So without further ado, I would like to turn the program over to Susie Askenase. Oh, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Susie Askenase, and following up on Claire, I want to give a shout out to the wonderful door dashers who spent their time delivering and these great treats. Thankfully, we were able to wait till after the deluge to do that. So Judy Salmon, Judy Myers, Nancy Peskin, and Sandy Harris, and Claire and I and Susan and so forth. It was a fun thing to do. Again, let me welcome everybody to the program. We're about to have a wonderful experience hearing from Dr. Helga Aurisch and Dr. Christine Gervais about the ornamental style of Art Nouveau, and also about Siegfried Bing, who is the Jewish art dealer, collector, and gallery owner who helped put Art Nouveau on the map. The Art Nouveau style throughout Europe and the United States was used to create exquisite paintings and sculpture and glass and interior design. Though it flourished between 1890 and 1910, it is a dazzling art of its time, and yet it's still so modern, isn't it? As curator of European art, Dr. Helga Aurisch is particularly qualified to discuss this topic. Helga was born in Germany and moved to New York at the age of 10. She attended Smith College and subsequently pursued graduate studies at the University of Vienna, Austria, and also at the University of Freiburg, Germany. There she earned her and received her Master's of Arts degree and her PhD in art history. Her professional career began at the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum of New York. Helga joined the staff of the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston in 2004. She joined as a curator of European art and has curated or organized or acted as a co-curator for numerous exhibitions of French and German 19th century art, including some of the exhibits that she's had. One of several of many were the masterpieces of French painting from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, 1800 to 1920, and Vincent Van Gogh, his life and art, Bert Meursault, Impressionist Original, and Monet de Picasso, a very private collection. Helga has published widely, and she speaks frequently on early 19th and early 20th century European art and culture. Emanu Sisterhood, as you heard from Claire, through Judaism through the Arts program, has been lucky enough to have Dr. Aurisch share her expertise with us, with her programs. And some of them were, where have all the paintings gone and who is hiding them? Jewish culture under the Habsburgs, and the wonderful presentation comparing the Jewish Impressionist painter Max Liebermann with Claude Monet. I imagine you remember these and many more over this past batch of years. Helga will also be talking about Siegfried Bing first, and then Christine Gervais will be discussing the decorative arts, and then Helga will continue with the Art Nouveau paintings. It's going to be a lovely afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Please welcome Dr. Helga Aurisch.
Thank you so much, Susie. It is always a great pleasure to do one of the programs for this particular group. It's always been a great joy, and not just for the wonderful cookies. I am so thankful. It's always such a delicious treat. Alejandro, could I have the first slide, please? Today we will talk about Siegfried Bing and Art Nouveau in context of having just installed a new gallery suggested by Gary Tintereau in the suite of galleries renovation of the Beck collection. Alejandro, the next slide, please. I would like to dedicate this lecture or this talk to our beloved Sarah Wheeler, who I know many of you will remember because she used to coordinate our talks with the Sisterhood. We lost her far too long ago, at a very young age. And in her memory, we were able to acquire two absolutely charming works of Japanese art. And I thought it would be so appropriate to bring these up, although they're not presently installed in our Art Nouveau gallery, but because of Siegfried Bing's great love of Japanese art, which was really the driving force behind his innovative move toward what we call Art Nouveau. So in memory of sweet Sarah, I would like to talk about Siegfried Bing and his enormous amount of work that he did in this direction. The next slide, please. At the suite of the second floor of the Beck Building, in the last gallery behind the Beck collection works, we have installed a number of works that are absolutely Art Nouveau. And it is a gallery that consists of paintings as well as of decorative arts, because that is what Art Nouveau was all about. As you can see here, we have brought some of our Vuillards and Rodin, Majorelle, and other works of art together in a very innovative look for us at this particular period. We also have a couple of very interesting guests that we have on display here. In particular, the wonderful Soroyas, two of them you can see here, the After the Bath, and the portrait of Tiffany. Could I have the next slide, please? The next slide, please. Thank you. This is this gorgeous, very, very colorful portrait of Louis Comfort Tiffany, painted by Joachim Soroya, who visited the United States in 1911. He was a great friend of Tiffany's, who was, of course, head of Tiffany's studio and himself, of course, a great designer. But I'd like to mention at this point that it was actually Clara Driscoll, a woman who was the head of the glass department, the glass, stained glass department of Tiffany's studio, who designed many of his wonderful vases. 30 designs actually are given to her these days. The fact that this was a woman and not Tiffany himself who developed these or designed these lamps has not been widely discussed, but has come forward just recently, and I did want to share that with you. I also like to point out how wonderful the comparison works between this gorgeous stained glass, the Dragonfly Lamp made between 1900 and 1920, and Soroya's very colorful and more impressionist painting than anything else in this collection. Could I have the next slide, please? Two other paintings, another by Soroya, After the Bath, a much more classical painting in many ways, and a painting by Hermen Camarasa, The Girls of Brianna from 1910-11, which is heavily influenced by Gustav Klimt, have also joined our gallery for this, for the following months. They will be with us probably to the end of the year, when the exhibition that has remained with us in another iteration, the Glories of Spain, will then be going on to, I believe, to the Royal Academy in London. But for the moment, we have these works here, and we're very happy to welcome them into the fold of our Art Nouveau works of art. Could I have the next slide, please? But about Siegfried Bing. Siegfried Bing was the son of Jacob Bing, who together with his brother owned a flourishing import-export business in Hamburg, where Siegfried was born. He was born in 1838, so he was, just to put it in relation, he was 2 years older than Claude Monet, about the same era indeed. The family was a very wealthy Jewish family, a very far-flung merchant family that had a branch in Paris, in France. Moses Bing, Jacob's brother, ran that part of the business. And very early after having finished school, Siegfried Bing went to France to work on that part of the family business. That part of the family actually had an interest in porcelain. They made and exported porcelain, and he was associated with this Paris firm of Laurier, which was making sort of Rococo-style porcelains until the 1880s. So he had a deep knowledge of the manufacture of porcelain. Well, in 1868, his father died, and the business in Hamburg was liquidated. It made both Siegfried and his brother Michael very wealthy. The same year, Siegfried married Johanna Baer from another wealthy and cultivated Hamburg family. She was his third cousin, and he moved his wife to Paris, where he had risen to the chef d'atelier of Laurier and Bing, which he would serve on after 1865. In 1867, his firm was awarded a medal at the Exposition Universelle, and he applied for permanent residency in France. The Bings spent the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 71, in Brussels, which will become very important for his further development. After returning to Paris, Siegfried revitalized the porcelain manufactory and he started to collect Oriental objects. There was a general mania for Japanese objects. He was not the first to collect these, but he became one of the most prominent collectors of Japanese works. In 1874, he was invited to join the East Asia Society in Tokyo. It is not quite clear what sparked his interest in these Japanese works. There were shops in Paris, especially La Porte Chinoise, where you could acquire these works. As you probably know, Japan had only opened up to the West in the very late 1850s. And these objects had become extremely avant-garde and snapped up by artists in particular, many of them the Impressionists like Monet, Manet, and others. Could I have the next slide, please? In 1878, there was another big universal art fair in Paris, and it featured a very, very large Japanese pavilion. And it really sparked a frenzy for Japanese objects. Bing at that time opened a shop at 19 Rue Chauchat, which was to coincide with the expo, and it was a great success. He decided at that point to corner the Japanese market, and he decided to establish contact with private Japanese collectors of antiquities, which no one had done before. In fact, Bing's brother-in-law, Michael Martin Beyer, had been in the Far East since 1870 as consul for the German legation in Tokyo. He was there from 70 to 71, and then again 77 to 81. And he had access to the highest of the Japanese society. And he had the opportunity there to view private collections and became a connoisseur himself. And he started to buy for himself and for Bing. Indeed, in 1880, Bing decided to travel to the Far East, and he made a sojourn of an entire year where he bought contemporary artists as well as antiquities. And he sent for his brother August to join him in Japan to ensure a steady supply of art to Paris. He opened further shops, one on the Rue Bleue, which sold high-end antiquities, and became the headquarters of Bing and Company, a commercial trading company in contemporary objects from the Far East. By 1886, he experienced some cash flow problems, and he started to sell objects of such high quality that museums like the Victoria and Albert Museum bought them. He also started to trade heavily to export to Japan, namely heavy machinery, munitions, and dynamite. And he became one of the major figures in Far East trade. He also traded with China and Indochina, and really he was a general import-export agent for the Syndicat de l'Industrie Française au Japon. Could I have the next slide, please? In 1888, Bing started a journal devoted to Japanese art called Le Japon Artistique. He published it in English, French, and German with color plates by Charles Gillot. They were sold relatively inexpensively, probably because it was subsidized by Bing. And through this art journal, which was, of course, disseminated all over Europe, he established new buyers for his shops. In the first issue, he identified Japanese art as Art Nouveau, the new art, that would have a lasting impact and a seductive influence on European art. The scholarship was sometimes somewhat doubtful, but it was more enthusiastic than necessarily knowledgeable. But it was enormously helpful in disseminating this love of Japanese objects throughout Europe and to elevate the ukiyo-e prints to serious art. And I just wanted to show you one item here that was sold through his shops, this beautiful Japanese flower stand. And if you look very closely, the foot of that flower stand has a couple of terrapins, just like the lovely little ones that we bought in honor of Sarah Wheeler. Could I have the next slide, please? He started to sell items from his shop to really important museums, including the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, to silk that you see here, and fukusa, which is more a paper or sometimes fabric, used very often to wrap presents, but absolutely stunning images that really attest to his incredible eye and knowledge of Japanese art. Can I have the next slide, please? He also had dealings with Vincent Van Gogh, who, as you know, spent 2 years from 86 to 88 living with his brother Theo in Paris. And he made his own collection of Japanese prints available to Vincent Van Gogh and encouraged him to sell them. Excuse me, with which Vincent did. He also worked after these prints. As you can see here, he used the prints by Utagawa Hiroshige, the plum tree, for his own painting, which is much more colorful, but definitely based on it. In fact, we have an absolute tracing of the Hiroshige work in Vincent's hand. And then you can see that, of course, the great artist that he was, he translated that into his own work of art, this wonderful small pear tree in blossom, of which there are quite a few by Vincent's own hand. Very fascinating that he should use somebody as highly artistic as Vincent to actually work for him. Could I have the next slide, please? In 1895, Bing decided to open his own shop. And it was very much based on the Maison in Brussels, where he had lived in 1870-71. When he opened this house, he called it Art Nouveau, as you can see here over the doorway. He had asked Victor Horta and Louis Bonnier to come up with drawings for this construction. And as you can see, it's quite revolutionary. These horizontal bands are something that was very unusual for Paris. And as you can see around this beautiful doorway is a flower that has become synonymous really with Art Nouveau, the sunflower. It was an extraordinary building. Could I have the next slide, please? And especially the foyer, the entrance hall, also designed by Bonnier. It was quite remarkable. Here we see a number of vitrines, cases with different works of art. And of course, it was Bing's big desire that Japanese art should influence decorative arts in the furnishing, in the modern furnishing of the elegant home. They should all work together as one unit and make a whole new style. For this building, he brought together different artists. For instance, he had Toulouse-Lautrec make designs for stained glass window to go over the door, which were carried out by Tiffany. He had a great regard for Tiffany. Of that later, but he assembled other artists as well. And in particular in this house, shop, could I have the next slides, please? He asked artists like Maurice Denis and Henry Vanderbilt to come up with design concepts for rooms, which were permanent installations. And here we see a small circular salon with panels by Albrecht Bénard, and the most successful one of the rooms was really Henry Vanderbilt, who's a Belgian artist's dining room with panels by Paul Ranson, who was one of the Nabi painters. This one was considered really the best iteration of the kind of art ensemble that Bing was going for. He left these rooms up for a very long time, but everything that you could see was for sale. Could I have the next slide, please? He did not commission artists to paint easel paintings for him, but he asked for artists like the Nabi, like Paul Sérusier, and pointillists like Edmond Cross to supply paintings that would also be sold in his shop that he considered to be very harmonious with the kind of interior designs that he was interested in. And could I have the next slide, please? He assembled a number of artists to decorate his gallery. It was glass by Émile Gallet, ceramics by Alexandre Bigot, lithographs and posters by Toulouse-Lautrec, prints by Mary Cassatt, and even sculpture by Rodin. As you can see here, there's a definite accent on Japanese works. The Divan Japonais that we see the poster for was actually a cafe in Paris with a Japanese twist. And as you can see, the Mary Cassatt print was very much influenced by Japanese works as well. Can I have the next slide, please? He furthermore assembled exhibitions every few months, really, that he would put together in his shop in Paris and then travel around Europe. So he put together in the year following the opening, the shop opened on December 26, 1995. And within the next year, he had a show of 60 plus works by Edvard Munch, the great Norwegian symbolist, Art Nouveau artist, where he introduced really all of the most important images that Munch had conceived so far for the French public. Can I have the next slide, please? And he had a very successful show of works by Tiffany, which he also traveled around Europe. I must say the opening of the shop was criticized very heavily by French press, who were not impressed by the ensemble, no, by the artworks, by the paintings, which they thought were really not very new. But his shows that went around Europe were indeed very, very successful, and he would continue to do that throughout his career. Could I have the next one, please? By 1898, he decided he needed more control over the works that he was selling. So he decided to establish ateliers, design studios, really, just the way Tiffany had done in New York. So there were design studios that really worked on, in the vicinity, in the proximity of his shop, of modeling, a design atelier, people making jewelry. And in fact, the head of the jewelry department was his own son, Marcel Bing, who had trained at the École du Louvre to become a wonderful jeweler. And so he had total control. He really was the end all and be all of control over any product that came or went from his gallery and from his shops. Could I have the next one, please? The crowning achievement really was the Exposition Universelle in 1900, where Bing had his own pavilion. As you can see here, it was constructed by the architect André Louis Arvidsson, and the wonderful panels or murals here of these elegant ladies were by Georges de Feur, one of his leading artists in the decorative arts. Could I have the next one, please? In it, again, in this pavilion, he showed these wonderful ensembles. Here I show you a number of things by Eugène Gaillard, who was also one of his favorite artists. And I leave it all to Christine to actually discuss the decorative art objects, because that really is not my qualification. But I'd like to show you another one that he had in his pavilion. The next slide, please. Two beautiful, just like in his gallery in Paris, he had permanent rooms that were designed by different artists. The sitting room by Edward Colonna, and a beautiful bedroom, again by Gaillard, all from 1900 in this pavilion at the World's Fair that, by the way, I think something like 12 million people attended. It was a huge success. It was a huge success for Bing. And if I could have the next slide, please. Beautiful furniture, especially Georges de Feur, who was actually of Dutch origin, made gilded furniture that is sort of Art Nouveau with a little hint at Rococo, if you will, this delicate furniture, gilded and very French in a way, surprisingly made by a Dutchman. And if I could have the next one, please. Other beautiful objects produced in Bing's ateliers were these crystalline vases and Georges de Fleur's beautiful vase from 1902, which, by the way, have now ended up in the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art correspondingly. Could I have the next one, please? His son, the jeweler, was also well represented in his shop and sold terribly well at the pavilion. There was a whole special department for jewelry. And as you can see here, these whiplash forms are very typical of Art Nouveau style. Could I have the next one, please? So by 1902, and this is, I end with this, when Bing advertised for his shop, Les Installations Modernes, he could list at the bottom all the different museums that had come to buy his works already, from Norway to Italy, in France, in Germany, in Austria, everywhere his works that he had collected, that he had Japanese objects as well as works produced in his workshops were being collected by the most outstanding museums of decorative arts. So he really can be considered the driving force behind this new movement. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Christine, who will be introduced, I think, as well. Thank you.
Hello, I'm introducing Christine Gervais, Director of Rienzi and the Curator of Decorative Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. She holds a BA in History from Trinity University, a Master's in American Studies from George Washington University, and a Master's in Philosophy with distinction in the History of Art from the University of Glasgow in Scotland. She joined the staff of the MFA in 2002. In her role at the MFA, Christine is responsible for the acquisition, research, and exhibition of pre-1900 decorative arts objects. She was an author in the publications Silver in American Art, and also in Art Across America, first major survey of American art in South Korea. Christine has previously lectured on topics including memorial jewelry, dining in the 18th century England, and French Art Deco. In 2008, she curated the MFA's first exhibition of portrait miniatures. Other exhibitions include circa 1900 decorative arts at the turn of the century, pattern repeat, wallpaper, then and now, as well as the major touring show Houghton Hall, Portrait of an English Country House. She was a lead curator of the first complete reinstallation of the MFA American Galleries, which opened to the public in November 2020. Her current exhibition is Fire/Works, Enamel Art Throughout the Centuries, which opened at the MFA in December 2020. So Christine.
Thank you so much. I am very, very honored to have a chance to speak to this group. I know that Helga has always enjoyed speaking to you and thinks of this group very fondly. So I'm very happy to participate today. So my job is to talk a bit about the decorative arts, the porcelain, the ceramic, the porcelain, the silver, the glass. So I'll begin here. I'm showing you an image of Paris at 1900 with a metropolitan entrance that you may recognize. So let's talk a little bit about what was happening in 1900. On New Year's Day, 1901, the English writer Thomas Hardy published a poem he had written the day before on the very last evening of the 19th century. In it, he mused darkly on the beginning of a new year, a new century, and the uncertainty of the change to come. The anxiety he felt as he contemplated what he called the century's corpse was a prevailing emotion at the time. At the end of January 1901, just 1 month later, England's Queen Victoria would pass away after a 63-year reign, which had defined and given name to the whole prior century. To them, the world was in flux. The changeable states of nature could also mirror the murky psychological realities of the time. This was an issue of considerable interest to the painters, poets, musicians, and decorative artists of the period. Their work explored the worlds of fantasy, dreams, and the exotic, and was the foundation for the decorative hedonism which defined Europe at the turn of the 19th century. Next slide. Oh, sorry, you've lost the identifier there. This is a work by a man named Ernst Haeckel from right around the turn of the century, because this was really a period of both science and spirituality. The 6th edition of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published in 1871. Illustrated for the first time and more inexpensive than previous editions, it gained a much wider audience. The development of new microscopes, as well as new land and sea exploration, yielded unknown species that were recorded in illustrated scientific manuals. Scientific paintings and drawings, like those of naturalist Ernst Haeckel, which I'm showing you here, shaped the development of Art Nouveau. Meticulously rendered deep sea creatures clambered out from the pages of his 1899 book, Art Forms in Nature, and then onto the facades and interiors of the cities of Europe. And I'm sorry we've lost the identifier because this has a wonderful Latin name, but is actually named very romantically for his deceased wife. And he considered it one of the most beautiful species he'd found, and it is a jellyfish. Next slide. And so I don't know if you can see, it seems like not that big a leap to me from the tendrils of that jellyfish to what you see here before you. And this is an example of what you would have seen on the buildings of Paris in 1900. So I'm just trying to take you from the microscope to the balcony of a building. This is a balcony by the great Hector Guimard. And it's extraordinary, it's an extraordinary cast iron balcony designed by Guimard, who is most famous for designing the magical entrances to the Paris Metro, which transformed the streets of the city in 1900. Guimard was a master of sculptural metal. Beginning in 1903, he began to work with the Saint-Dizier foundry, and his goal was to develop new designs for cast iron, which challenged the creative possibilities of industrial art. Quote from Guimard, "When I see a house, I think of the spectacle we offer people," unquote. So he's thinking about what can he do to make a house spectacular. The style Guimard, as he termed it, came to encompass a world of architectural details, from drain pipes to doorknobs, all inspired by plant life and the modern vocabulary of Art Nouveau. The whiplash lines in the balcony's design capture the sinuous movement of climbing flowering plants or jellyfish feelers. These are the original turn of the century iron panels from the Saint-Dizier foundry, and molds for all subsequent castings were likely made from this. These molds would have meant multiples, so you could have these iron vines climbing wherever they wanted to go. Next slide. Another example of something in the streets of Paris. You may have been lucky enough to see this, it still exists. This is the Hôtel Lalique at 40 Cours de la Reine, still looking exactly like this today. René Lalique is recognized today as one of the most brilliant glass designers of the 20th century. He trained as a jeweler and began in the 1890s experimenting with glass, the medium that he would spend the rest of his career mastering. His glass featured flowers, vines, or animals placed amid trailing and swirling patterns that perfectly reflected the naturalistic, sinuous style of Paris at the time. Lalique moved in 1902 to a new residence and workshop at 40 Cours de la Reine. The building was a renovation that totaled 5 floors, with the first 2 floors showing retail space for his business and his workshop and his residence above. And I think here, most critics think that this is his most important architectural statement. These famous glass doors contain a design of pine cones and branches, with each panel being a different part of the total composition. They continue from, and what makes it even more exciting is that design continues outward from the glass into the exterior of the building, and then it will go all the way up to the window railing. So it's a pine tree in flower, and then you can even see the stalks going up the side. But as you see here, Art Nouveau, as it becomes, as it sort of expands and expresses itself, was an all-enveloping style whose flowing lines, I think, can be understood as a metaphor for the freedom and release sought by its practitioners and admirers from the weight of artistic tradition and critical expectation. They are literally breaking free of the Victorian age that has gone before. Next slide. The new field of psychology also became much discussed and highly topical, particularly with Sigmund Freud's publication of Interpretation of Dreams in 1899. His attempts to analyze and understand the dark recesses of the mind revealed what could not be seen and provided some explanations for society's disquiet. Increased interest in the occult and mysticism stemmed from a similar desire to understand one's place in an uncertain world through whatever means possible. This wildly dramatic vase was produced by the Bohemian ceramic factory Amphora. The factory was renowned for developing a unique version of Art Nouveau, distinctive for its use of dragons, bats, and nightmarish beasts. Unsettling yet magical, the vase design was a centerpiece of the firm's award-winning display at the 1900 Exposition Universelle, the World's Fair held in Paris that year. Although inspired by the stylized dragons on ancient Chinese porcelain vases, this fully realized creature, and you could walk around it, it is three-dimensional and you are intended to sort of see it unfold itself. But it envelops and grips the vase with a menacing grace. The long whiskers, mane, horns, and whiplash tail create the sense of undulating motion typical of Art Nouveau. Next slide. La femme nouvelle, or the new woman, was also trying to find a new place in society at the turn of the century. In 1889, the first International Congress on Women's Rights was held in Paris. The increasing urgency in the suffrage movement was felt across Europe. The idea of women freeing themselves from the home and entering the workforce, smoking, wearing trousers, or riding bicycles created additional anxieties for men with one foot in the past and the other in dangerous modern times. The designer of the cigarette box I show you here on the left was actually Kate Harris, a female silversmith at the English firm of William Hutton and Sons. Hutton opened a small London manufactory in 1898 specifically for the production of Art Nouveau silver and became a major supplier to the artistic retailer Liberty & Co. Her popular designs were chiefly in this new fluid style featuring stylized plant designs, and she would actually get a special award at the 1900 fair. And I think you can sort of see, so here's a woman designing a cigarette box in a moment where cigarettes were extremely modern and very risque. So it's a very interesting little story to me about this moment at this change of the century. Next slide. And here we are at the 1900 Exposition. In the midst of this change and unrest, the new style captured the imagination of the public at the fair, which was held, as I said, in that turn of the century year. Sharing elements of the French Rococo in this style, including stylized motifs designed from nature, fantasy, and Japanese art, the objects shown at the fair were unusual, vibrant, and technically impressive and expressed modern ideas, much like the fair itself. Again, I'm showing you here one of my favorite images, which is of the famous moving sidewalks of the 1900 Exposition. There were miles and miles of moving sidewalks that you could hop on. And if you see sort of in the middle, there's a young girl sort of standing on it. It's a moving sidewalk. And this was the Place des Invalides. This is where you could hop on and it would just sort of take you around. There was a fast one and a slow one. But again, the idea of, again, again, another nice metaphor for the world at this moment. Next slide. This extraordinary vase was made by the Dutch factory Rosenberg. The first successful versions of their eggshell porcelains were shown in Holland in 1899. Again, this is talking about technical innovation because that is definitely a thread through this story as well. They showed this ware to great international acclaim at the Exposition. Rosenberg, the way they made their pieces was they were slip cast into a mold that was spun so that this very, very thin slip would be flung to the sides of the mold and everything would be cast entire and of itself. So you could have these crazy and in fact, Their forms are strange, and their angles and their curves are unusual. Rosenberg's is always long and thin, eccentric, very flamboyant in its decoration. But because of the way that they were made, everything was all of one, a single piece. So you don't have spouts added on. You didn't have to add on handles. It just looks like it sort of flowed out of the mold itself. The porcelain, much like as Helga mentioned, Art Nouveau was not universally accepted, and its expressions not universally accepted either. So with this porcelain had great critics back in Holland who found the pieces utterly bizarre, but they were an instant hit in Paris. I also love the fact that if you picture this, this is eggshell porcelain. If you hold it up to the light, you can see through it. So how do you transport something like this from Holland to Paris? You transport it in hay-filled wagons. So at one point you have great technology, and then it's as if you are still in the pre-industrial age. Next slide. The furnishings exhibit at the fair in the new fashion continued the tradition of great French craftsmanship. They used luxury veneers, marquetry, and finely cast gilt mounts was definitely something you would have seen in the 18th century. And Art Nouveau, when you're looking at furniture, is definitely calling back to the Rococo. They like that curved line. They like that high finish of craftsmanship. And I'm showing you here one of the greatest exponents of this, the maker Louis Majorelle. While Majorelle made this désert and he used traditional methods of making, he looked to nature and Japanese art as sources of inspiration. The asymmetry and strongly delineated lines of Japanese woodcuts inspired his compositions, visible here in the inlaid marquetry panels on the bottom. Majorelle used inlay to create large-scale pictorial pieces that are very different from the smaller, more formal patterns used by cabinet makers working in more traditional historical styles. Here, the doors are inlaid with birds eating mother-of-pearl grapes. And if you can just follow the dark outline, you can see the markings of the birds on both panels. Majorelle's display at the fair helped to establish him as the leading maker of Art Nouveau furniture, work which he had begun in 1890 under the influence of the designer and botanist Émile Gallé. Next slide. The single unifying source of artistic inspiration for the style came from the looks and the dynamics of nature, often rendered through the use of sinuous or whiplash lines. Several Art Nouveau designers were in fact trained as botanists, and the filaments of a blossom or even an insect's feeler could serve as inspiration for everything from the balcony of a house to the vase on a mantelpiece. The leading maker of Art Nouveau glass in France was Émile Gallé, famous for his dramatic and sometimes disturbing evocations of nature. Gallé was an artist of remarkable technical skill and inventiveness. After inheriting his father's ceramics and glass business, he began exploring wide-ranging techniques, from historical methods such as acid etching, engraving, enameling, and mold blowing to novel experiments. This ewer on the left is one of his earliest expressions of the fluidity and twisting motion which would define the decorative arts in France by 1900. It's 1885, so just around the beginning of this idea of things sort of moving, looking like they're in motion, and trying to mimic the actual dynamism of something that's growing out of the ground. Gallé had also received training in botany as a young man. This background, as well as his technical proficiency, allowed him to create complex, naturalistic compositions in glass. In this vase on the right, an inner pale green glass, which is sort of mimicking Chinese celadon, was encased in colored glass that was then carved away in the cameo technique. What remains is an unsettlingly beautiful object on which blood red water lilies seem to float over and above cool green water. Next slide. As Helga has described, the term Art Nouveau derives from the influential art dealer Samuel Bing's gallery L'Art Nouveau. Bing, originally a dealer in Japanese art, sold exceptional objects by contemporary artists working in the style that he would help to define, including the French designers Guimard, Lalique, and Gallé, as well as a host of artists from other countries. Henry van de Velde was one of the leading practitioners of the Art Nouveau style in Belgium, where he designed architectural interiors and everyday objects as organic forms that expressed harmoniously the fluidity of the style. His work brought him to the attention of Bing, who commissioned him to design the actual rooms of his gallery and thus the environment of l'Art Nouveau. Unabashedly luxurious and sensual, Art Nouveau trampled many of the Victorian age's orthodoxies of design, dismissing old strictures with its fanciful approach. Here you see Vanderbilt reinterpret an ice cream serving set into implements that look as if they are already melting. So they go together with this idea of sort of motion. Next slide. Deeply influenced by the socially aware teachings of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, Art Nouveau designers endeavored to achieve the synthesis of art and craft. The metalworker W.A.S. Benson was an artist who found himself part of both artistic environments, so Art Nouveau and arts and crafts, which come just before, but they bleed into each other. As art historians, we love there to be defined moments, but they kind of overlap always. Benson was a designer for William Morris since his university days, and his work was also admired by Bing, who sold it through his shop in Paris. Benson's organic designs were widely acclaimed in books and journals, with one in 1896 calling them palpitatingly modern. Next slide. On the left is a vase designed by American artist Louis Comfort Tiffany, which is intended to suggest a crocus or tulip waiting to blossom. Impressed with the artist's ability to simulate the details of a flower in glass, Bing sold similar vases in 1894 to the Musée du Luxembourg in Paris, a huge coup for the American designer. Tiffany was in fact the only American to be shown at Bing's gallery, where his work was shown besides that of Gallet and Vanderbilt. So I'm showing you here on the right, one of the pieces that was actually sold to the Musée du Luxembourg. Next slide. A few years earlier in 1892, Tiffany, who was the son of the founder of Tiffany & Co., had developed and patented a new type of iridescent glass called Favril. Tiffany's designs were born out of the simplicity and naturalism that he and many other Art Nouveau artists admired in Japanese art. In this early example, and from the museum's collection, a pattern of peacock feathers climbs up the shimmering form. And this type of glass, Favril glass, would actually earn Tiffany a grand prize at the 1900 fair. I'm showing you here on the left an example that was actually photographed in Bing's gallery. Next slide. Bing was a leading dealer of Japanese prints, as Helga has already discussed, and he encouraged his artists to incorporate the unique compositional traits and motifs of Japanese prints, not only in their pictures, but in furniture, glassware, and other genres of decorative art as well. Thus, the dragonflies, irises, orchids, and water lilies, so beloved by nature-obsessed Japanese printmakers, went on to become especially prominent in Art Nouveau. This, which is the version of the Dragonfly lamp that is in the museum's collection, it's actually a hanging chandelier, was, as Helga mentioned, designed by Clara Driscoll, who is probably the most famous of what are called the Tiffany girls, the women who ran the glass studio. And this quickly became one of the most famous lamps that Tiffany made, and has now become an icon of that studio. To the point that it was actually shown by Bing in his exhibition L'Art Nouveau at London in 1899. And then a year later at the 1900 fair, Driscoll's lamp would win a prize. Tiffany, however, would never give anybody else's name to designs that were shown under Tiffany's studio. So as Helga said, many of these women have only now been, within the last, say, 20 years, been sort of retrieved from history because they did sign their designs, but when they went out into the public, their names were not on them. Next slide. The maker of the remarkable vase on the left was a man named Taxil Doua, a pioneering French ceramicist known for his classical work for the Sèvres porcelain manufactory, as well as his own experimental wares. His interest in Japanese pottery led him to create novel shapes, often based on natural forms. He spent much of his career working to perfect the dramatic glazes which mark his avant-garde pieces. Both creative impulses are seen here, where you have a violet flambe glaze that drips down a wonky kind of gourd-shaped vase. In 1901, a representative group of French ceramics from Bing's gallery was put on display in Tiffany's studio showroom in Manhattan. Very varied assortment. It included the porcelains of Taxil Doua, showing the far reach of Bing's influence in the dissemination of the style. Tiffany, impressed by the European ceramics, would even establish a pottery department at Tiffany Studios for Art Nouveau ceramics. I'm showing you here on the right that display in 1901. Next slide. This vase demonstrates the technical virtuosity and high quality that the Lotz factory achieved in the late 19th century, a Bohemian glass factory. In 1897, the factory director saw Tiffany glass in one of Bing's exhibitions and was inspired to create his own version, combining iridescent glass with pulled trails or ribbons of metallic colors. This example is from an experimental line called Phénomène. The effect is as if waves or feathers were moving slowly across the form. And again, this is all really engineered by Bing and his patronage of these artists and how he shows them and promotes them. Next slide. Those artists working at the twilight of the 19th century and the dawn of the 20th were part of a rapidly changing world. Unprecedented advances in almost every sphere of life were met by an equally pervasive sense of impending chaos. Artists were consciously trying to break free from past convention. In the place of the historical styles that had dominated the Victorian age, they wanted to find an Art Nouveau, a new art appropriate to modern life. And I think we still respond to it today. And I think you should all recognize, if you've been to Paris, the legacy of this. Guimard still reigns high as you walk through the streets of Paris. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. I think that was a wonderful exposition of the quality of works that being brought to the public, and of course the quality of Art Nouveau itself as it is particularly expressed through decorative arts. Could I have the next slide, please? Art Nouveau was a completely international movement. In fact, there are many different names for this movement, from Art Nouveau to Tiffany style, Jugendstil in Germany, Stil Nuil, Stile Florale. It really spread all over the continent. Could I have the next slide, please? I'm just going to be very brief on my look at the spread of this movement. It really, as Christine said, started as a reaction against over-industrialized objects. And it has its roots in the English arts and crafts movement and the aesthetic movement, which really the foremost representatives are William Morris and his architect, Philip Webb. And I show you here a couple of pictures from Morris's really groundbreaking house called the Red House, which he inhabited from 1860 to 65, where everything was artistically made along new lines. And one of the principles of Art Nouveau was to get away from ugly industrial production of everyday objects and to make the house beautiful again through crafted works that all flowed together. One of the problems that we will see with Morris and of course with the other Art Nouveau artists everywhere is that beautifully crafted objects tend to be expensive. And so in a way, it really didn't quite achieve its ultimate goal of making these objects available to everyone, but they made them available, some to an upper end clientele and some to a more, slightly less endowed group. But certainly the effort was there, and it's symbolic, of course, and characteristic perhaps that it should start in Europe's most industrialized nation, namely England. This reaction against historicizing styles and ugly production of everyday objects. Could I have the next slide, please? The other source for Art Nouveau is, as in Bing's case, is this great love for Japanese art. And in England in particular, he's actually American, but working in England, it was James Abbott Mcneil Whistler, whose interpretation of Japanese art was incredibly important. In his painting Nocturne in Gold and Blue, the old Battersea Bridge from 1872, we see an influence of Japanese prints that really predates anything we see in Impressionism in France. Completely this sort of off-centered composition, this moodiness. It's absolutely very typical of the Japanese influence. Probably his most important and most celebrated work is the Peacock Room at the Freer Gallery in Washington, which many of you will know. And the woman who dominates that room is this beautiful princess from the land of porcelain. It was all made for a collection in England, but in the end bought by Freer and brought to Washington, where it is an incredible ensemble. And it is one of those rooms that truly can be described as a Gesamtkunstwerk, where everything flows together, designed by one mind. Can I have the next slide, please? The person who was most influenced by Morris on the continent was Henry Vanderbilt, who had trained as an architect. And he took up Morris's idea of this designed house when he built his own house, Haus Blumenwerf in Uccle in 1896, just about the same time that Bing opened his shop. And one of the chairs that he designed for this house is this beautiful stylized chair, very simple in its line, but this lovely curvature that is so typical for Art Nouveau. And Vanderbilt did another great thing for us ladies. He designed clothes that you could actually sit in. So it is a revolution in fashion against the corseted style of high fashion of around 1900 that really restricted women's movements incredibly. And so these reform dresses, high-waisted, slightly medieval looking, are a great contribution to the development of fashion altogether. Could I have the next slide, please?
Yes, they are, of course.
Henry Vandervelde was probably the best designer of ensembles of furniture around the turn of the century, and he was celebrated all over Europe. He did an interior for La Maison Moderne, which was a shop run by Julius Meyer-Graefe, who was a great proponent of Bing's. He was German, but he was working in Paris as well. They supported each other enormously. And the other one I show you here is actually a cigar company for which Vandervelde designed their shop in Berlin. And as you can see here, just the kind of whiplash form, this naturalistic form that Christine was talking about in the individual objects translated into an entire room here. Could I have the next one, please? One artist we hadn't mentioned and who's absolutely in the center of the development is Alfons Mucha, who was Czech, who worked in Paris though, although he had trained in Austria, and who is probably the master of the poster, which is one of the art forms that really is developed during this time. And it's wonderful because in a way it brings painting to the outdoors. These were displayed as advertisements. And he was very often asked to make advertisements for the great Sarah Bernhardt, whose poster you see here at the very left. And he developed this image of this beautiful young woman, flowing hair, very positive, very seductive, all these whiplash forms. And often he uses this sort of halo around her, almost Byzantine type halo. She is sort of the positive version of the femme fatale, which is a woman's type that is particularly associated with Art Nouveau. Sarah Bernhardt would, of course, bring her to the stage, but others as well, Beardsley and others, Salome is particularly celebrated around this time. But Mucha is the more flowery one, the more positive one, whose work was really disseminated all over Europe. Can I have the next one, please? Next slide, please. It was a style that was also celebrated in Germany. In Munich, it was called Jugendstil, after the magazine Jugend, which was started to be published in 1896, just about the same time as Bing's shop opened in Paris. And the most important personality as far as painting goes was Franz von Stuck, who has this evil, I think, this very evil vision of the femme fatale, whom he calls here the sin, and who is typically ensconced in this very, very decorative frame, which is something that the Viennese artist whom we associate most closely with Art Nouveau, Gustav Klimt, would take up. Can I have the next one, please? Vienna became known as one of the great centers for Art Nouveau. And it's, of course, Gustav Klimt and his fellow artists who had seceded from the academic tradition of painting and struck out on their own. And as you can see here, Gustav Klimt, who had actually trained not in the Academy for Painting, but in the Academy for Applied Arts, who has this deep sense of the ornamental. And he combines from very early on works with this sort of Art Deco feeling. And you see that in his Palace Athena, where this frame is also designed by him. His celebrated ceiling painting for medicine for the university at the center here, and even for in his portrait of his girlfriend or mistress, Emilie Flöge, whom you probably know as a designer of fashion. She owned a fashion shop, design atelier in Vienna. And the two work very closely together, and in a way they speak the same language. Could I have the next slide, please?
Nope. Been there, done that.
The secession movement took place in 97, and very soon after that, they decided to build their own building where they could, these secessionist artists could display their own art in an appropriate place, because they really wanted to break away from the stultifying kind of historicism that was the art of the day. And so they managed very quickly to have this little building put up, very unusual, with this golden cupola, which is known as the cabbage, in the golden cabbage in Vienna, and much loved these days. And they used it to display their own works appropriately. Could I have the next slide, please? One of the works that was designed for the building was Klimt's great Beethoven frieze, which you can still see displayed there, which combines this visionary interpretation of Beethoven's symphonies or Beethoven's style with this gold application of very Art Deco, very decorative art approach to painting. Could I have the next slide, please? They were very much influenced by two artists from England, in fact, by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who's actually Scots, and his wife, Margaret MacDonald. And as you can see here, just around the time when the secession building has been opened, these people in Scotland were designing this very simple white furniture, very, very modern even to our eyes 120 years later. And unlike the Parisian and Belgian style, which is much more floral, the Scottish and then the Viennese style has a tendency to be much more geometric, to celebrate the square and these very balanced rectangles in their art. These two designs on the top here are for Hill House in near Glasgow, and both the artists, Mackintosh and MacDonald, worked together on these. And we see another design for a music room, which I don't think was ever executed as is designed here, but Margaret MacDonald, one of the other great women artists of this period, designed a triptych for a music room for Fritz Werndorf's villa in Vienna. Fritz Werndorf was extraordinarily instrumental in founding a shop, the Wiener Werkstätte. Could I have the next slide, please? Which is one of the great design studios for Art Nouveau in Central Europe. It was founded in 1903. By three artists, Hoffmann, Coleman Moser, and Dagobert Peche, with the business founding, the financial support of Fritz Werndorf. In it, they concentrated on, just like in Bing's case, making their own decorative arts. As you can see here, there is a tendency to this much more geometric kind of art, beautiful, so stunningly modern looking things like the silver baskets that Hoffmann designed, or that I always have to laugh at the Sitzmaschine, because it's a machine for sitting that I think the museum actually owns one of, or his beautiful brooches, which in fact I would love to own one of, but really a little bit just outside my budget. But let me show you the other two artists who co-founded this Wiener Werkstätte. Could I have the next slide, please? As Coleman Moser, he and Hoffmann together designed one of the most radical chairs of the 20th century, this very cubist looking chair with a checkerboard. But he also designed some, Coleman Moser, you may remember from an exhibition we did a couple of years ago, much more fluid works of art, both glass and jewelry. And the other designer was Dagobert Peche, who was, as you can see, much more Rococo inspired, very whimsical and very charming in its way. If I may have the next slide, please. But these artists too insisted on high quality. And I just show you here the comparison of Klimt's portrait of his mistress, Emilia Flöge, and Dagobert Peche's vase, which you can, I think you can't get any closer than this to see the correspondence between high art and decorative arts. And we want decorative arts to be lifted to the same acknowledgement of worth as painting and architecture are. And I think it's very easy to appreciate this closeness, especially if we look at the next slide, Alejandro. It makes it even closer, because this is just her upside down. There were a number, really a great number of female artists who were working for the Wiener Werkstätte. And they are actually planning an exhibition in Vienna on these female artists. I think there were actually 180 of them. This should take place this year. I don't know with COVID whether that is going ahead, but I show you a couple of works by female artists here. Maria Likart's, this beautiful fashion design, greeting cards, which were very, very popular from the Wiener Werkstätte. This is Martha Alber and Gebrüder Kohn, produced in 1910-11, or Wally Wieseltier, this gorgeous little glass decorated from 1917. I find it very interesting that the greeting cards come in Hebrew as well as in German, with greetings for the new year. And they use different kinds of textile design with this particular greeting for many years in the early part, before World War I. The Wiener Werkstätte actually continued until the 30s, but its heyday really was between 1903 and 1914. Could I have the next one, please? Of course, one of the great achievements of the Wiener Werkstätte's jewelry, in comparison to one of the great, great works of art from that period, which is Gustav Klimt's portrait of Adela Blochbauer I. This was painted in 1907. It was commissioned by her husband as a gift for an anniversary. And it is simply the epitome of Klimt's decorative style, where he really combines his love for decorative art with his incredible style of painting. Completely, completely innovative, completely personal. There is no one else in the world who does anything like it. As you can see here, she is subsumed in golden textures. You can see the chair that she's sitting in, but then also the floating panels of her dress. And the inspiration for these motifs at this point have been traced back to Mycenaean gold, to Egyptian, as you can probably see the eye there, to the wonderful mosaics of Ravenna in Italy. It is this wonderful amalgamation of style, but in an artist's hand, which is really quite amazing. You probably know the story of Adela Blochbauer, who herself died in 1925 and who had left her collection of her art to her husband with the wish that these paintings by Klimt should go to the Österreichische Galerie. Unfortunately, she could not have predicted that the Nazis would take over Austria in 1938 and would steal these works from her family and give them to the, or install them in the museum. And it took years and years for the heirs of Adela, Mrs. Altmann, residing in Los Angeles, to finally make her claims come through, and the painting was returned to her. It was bought by the owner of the Neue Galerie in New York for the astonishing amount of over $135 million by Ronald Lauder, who had been the American ambassador to Austria and who is displaying it very proudly in this beautiful museum on Fifth Avenue called the Neue Galerie, which is the repository for Austrian and German art of the first quality in New York. Could I have the next slide, please? Klimt painted Adela again a couple of years later in a completely different style. As you can see, much more floral, much more colorful, without the gold, in completely a new world. But if you look closely in the background there, you can see little Asian writers. And it really is a testament to the influence of Asian art on Klimt at this time. Can I have the next slide, please? This is very much the style, I think, that Hermen Camarasa picked up on. The painting we have, that we were hosting for a while in the Art Nouveau gallery, which really does make his figures very, very decorative in this later Klimt manner. It also reminds me of these charming little figurines by another female artist working for the Wiener Werkstätte, the little seasons, and these Hermen Camarasa figures seem to have that kind of porcelain texture to me that seem to be almost melting into each other and into the background. I have the next slide, please. One of the great paintings of Klimt, and also that is a complete testament of overlapping works from the Wiener Werkstätte and his paintings, is this painting of Friederike Maria Beamonti from 1916, in which she is wearing a dress that is now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Costume Institute, and a lovely little coat, which she's actually turned inside out at Klimt's behest. So he has even more of a decorative palette to work with. And in the background, we see even more of these, or the Asian writers and warriors have become even more important than in the Blochbauer second portrait I just showed you. An overall decorative effect that's almost overwhelming, but very typical of Klimt at this particular time. Have the next slide, please. Have the next slide, please. We may be stuck. We have the next slide, please. There we go. And with this, I'd like to end. It is probably the most well-known and the greatest collaboration of Wiener Werkstätte artists. It's the Palais Stocklet in Brussels. And I think it's very symptomatic that we come to a close in Brussels, where Siegfried Bing really got the idea of this maison moderne, this Art Nouveau, where he had first seen this in 1870. The Palais Stocklet was commissioned in the year that Bing died in 1905. He had, of course, nothing to do with it, but I think it's wonderful to sort of wrap it up in the same place. It was built by Joseph Hoffmann, the great architect of the Wiener Werkstätte, and it was completely furnished by him as well. Can I have the next slide, please? the crowning glory of the building is its wonderful dining room, which I'm sure you have seen in many pictures. Nobody has been allowed into this house because they would be overrun. And so I can only talk to you about it from these pictures, but I wanted to come to a close on the international movement of Art Nouveau in this room. And I'll show you the next slide, and last slide, please, is a total ensemble of Klimt's favorite painting, or most famous paintings, perhaps, The Expectation, The Tree of Life, and The Embrace, which are featured on the walls of this dining room, and which really, I think for many of us, bring all of Art Nouveau together. The whiplash curves, the golden designs of Klimt, the Oriental influences, and an international appeal of this fantastic style, which was, if not invented by Siegfried Bing, certainly brought to the fore by him. And with that, I would like to thank all of you, especially my colleague Christine, for doing such a wonderful presentation of this topic, and we'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. This was a wonderful, erudite, and fascinating, really fascinating presentation. Thank you both, Helga and Christine. We have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
This one is for Christine. A caller asks, what would you estimate the value of the Tiffany tulip glasses at today? Yes.
I would put them about $10,000 to $15,000 if you tried to buy them in today's market. The flower forms, a full-on Favre vase, far more.
And what about the Tiffany lamps?
Well, the Tiffany lamps is a different market, and that's had its ups and downs. The 1980s were a real heyday for Tiffany lamps because there were major collectors like Barbra Streisand and other people who were very happy to have them in their interiors. They come and go. They are very specific tastes and very specific fashion, but there is always a lingering market. Sometimes it's said quite high, sometimes not quite as high. But depending on the rarity of the model, I mean, 6 figures, generally speaking. If it's not a rare model, or the glass choices are not that interesting, or the base, ours is a chandelier, so it hangs, but obviously most of them have the bases that would go with it. And you want all of those things to be tight and intact and integral to each other. All of those things are variants on it, but it's a very interesting market. I think I would say Tiffany lamps helped keep some of the auction houses in business through the 1900s.
Rojo.
And Helga, we have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Are Art Nouveau and Art Deco the same? And
No, they're not. They're not. Good question, though. And I sometimes misspeak too. Art Nouveau is actually the older one, typically because of course it's called new. Art Deco really is from an exposition in the 1920s. So it is the much more geometric and later version of decorative arts and an art form. Art Nouveau is the one that's more floral, around 1900, and they are quite different.
And there's a question again about where in the Beck Building.
Okay.
Go to the Art Nouveau Gallery and see these wonderful.
The Art Nouveau Gallery is if you come upstairs in the Beck Building on the 2nd floor, if you come up the escalator, you head to your right to the Beck collection, which we have reinstalled this summer, by the way. And if you go through the Beck collection to the right, you end up in a room that is a very different color. It's light green, and it is the Art Nouveau gallery. So it's number 227, and it is at the end of the suite of Beck galleries.
That's great. Thank you so very much. This was wonderful, as always.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. I ate the cookies.
Good for you.
These were beautiful pictures, very beautiful.
Yeah, and explanations. I mean, wonderful. It's like taking a college level art history course.
Right.
Thank you so much, folks.
Well, it's been great fun doing this together with Christine. It's been such a sort of an eye-opening thing to see flat art and three-dimensional art really coming together. And I hope we can collect more. It'd be lovely. We have a couple of, the wish list is there.
Ever growing.
Ever growing. But it is.
Has a kept in Houston.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you all so much. It's been great fun, and at another time, perhaps we can all see it in person.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Is there another one?
Yeah, it said 7, but I'm not seeing him.
Uh-uh.
We answered 4.
Yeah.
We're just gonna let it go.
Yeah.